Hello, everybody. This is Joshua Hatton with One Nation Under Whisky podcast. I'm joined today, and I'm joined as always by Susannah Skiver Barton, my co-host for now going on 8 years of this. Oh, am I doing that wrong? Wait, no. Jason's my co-host, my mate, my business partner. Jess is my co-host.
Cocoa.
My mate.
Cocoa? It's a warm cocoa?
Cocoa. It's like Coco Chanel. What's that? Cocoa
butter?
Coconuts.
Coconuts. Going coconuts. I've got Jason Johnston yelling, Jess Lomas, and back again, the lovely Susannah Skiver Barton, here to talk about a tradition.
Tradition!
A year in preview tradition for us here at One Nation Under Whisky. Susannah, welcome back to the podcast.
I am thrilled to be here.
I'm just thrilled to have you back. There's a lot to talk about. I mean, we can look to the past, which I think we should do at points, but I am excited to look to the future with you on whiskey.
Me too. I've jotted some thoughts down. I'm ready.
All right. Do you wanna?
Oh boy.
Do you wanna set this up? Do you wanna?
No. Please, you are the illustrious host with your illustrious co-host. Please proceed, and I will insert my thoughts as
I
needed.
guess my initial question for you is, thinking back to the beginning of 2023 and what you thought 2023 may look like, here we are. Is there anything that surprised you along the way that we may not have brought up, or maybe we brought it up and things turned out slightly differently than you expected, or is going in a different course?
To be honest, I did not listen back to last year's episode. I have no idea what what I said.
We said we'd be checking the receipts as well.
I would love it if you guys have a list of things that I said and we want to go through and see how wrong I was. I would love that. That's a great activity. Did anything surprise me about this year? I think it surprised me to see that this American single malt official recognition is still kind of dragging on. It's now 2 years since I was told by someone who was at the time the master distiller at a major American single malt distillery, we're on the cusp. Of course, it was a guess because he had no secret intel from the government. This is all just being held up, on the official legal governmental end. But we're still kind of nowhere. We're kind of in the final stages of waiting for that official thing to come down, and it hasn't. And I don't know. I've kind of given up. Wait, I'm just okay, it'll come when it comes. I don't think it is going to make a huge difference. We can talk about that later. Am I surprised that people are still paying way too much money for bourbon? Yeah. A little.
We did discuss that at length in the last episode.
I'm sure we did.
Yeah, that hasn't seemed to die down in the way that I expected it to. I saw a video recently, and the person there was just giving people a tour across these 20 tables, and it was all of their individual picks of all of their individual bourbon barrels, rye barrels, and they said, okay, you want part of this? You go to this table and you grab this bottle. You go to this table, you get this bottle. You've got to buy all these bottles. Oh, you want a Weller too? Boom, there it is. And it's set up to be this machine of just welcoming people in, letting them grab bottles, taking their money, and everybody being on with their way. It was a wild video to watch.
That's really interesting. I'd love to see that.
Yeah. Somewhere on the Facebook.
Was there a system attached to this? You had to buy A in order to buy B in order to buy C? Or it was just hey, if you head over that way, you get that bottle over there. But if you also want to add, come on over here.
Yeah, no, you were being led through the IKEA of whiskey shops, right? You had to follow the arrows, and it was these smaller brands. And okay, you've purchased those. At least this is how it seemed to me. You purchased those, and you have now unlocked your choice of a Weller 12 or a Weller 107.
And that's the part I was driving at, because for us here in Virginia, I think the system is so convoluted now that the thought of even buying a bourbon is completely off the table, right? Like, there's now emails that talk about product drops, but not all stores have all bottles, and some managers are at their discretion. And it's like, why would I leave my house? Like, this is just a miserable experience now. So to hear your story there, Joshua, where there is a system in place, like, the prices are too high, the selections are, are they exciting? That's a conversation for another day. But now the system attached to it is so convoluted.
Well, you can thank the control state for that.
I quite like hearing
I'm in North Carolina, and
I was going to say, I think it's really funny hearing Jason say it like that. We have the same problem here in the UK with, maybe not like, I guess we don't have store picks with bourbons in quite the same way you guys do overseas, far away. But we have the same thing when people decide they want to get hold of like Pappy or any of the BTAC releases, that the stores that traditionally have them now have to come up with really creative ways of how you do it. My favourite things that Good Spirits here in Glasgow tend to do is if they have a really popular thing, they have a competition where people write haikus. If you want to buy one of these bottles, they encourage you to write a haiku. Or their allocation, I think, for the Pappy stuff last year was so small that they didn't even have a full tasting's worth of stock. I've done it in previous years where we've been to a tasting, and then the people that were in the room at the tasting, they just pulled names out of hats. You registered your interest if you thought you wanted to buy anything, and then the first way was people in the room, bums on seats, pull a name out of a hat, and if your name came up, then you could purchase whatever was being drawn. I've been at other places in the UK. Milroy's did something similar to that in London, but it just makes me laugh that, like, when I go to the US, you've got all these kind of store picks of amazing bourbons, and we get literally none of that here. It's just not a thing. It's so weird to hear you guys talking, and you did last year in the episode, about these kind of like store picks and what's attached to it and the pricing. It's kind of like just watching you guys through some sort of like looking glass. It's just not a consideration we have in the UK at all. People punch each other for Pappy, and that's about it.
This is kind of one of the things I wanted to look ahead towards. You've given me a beautiful segue. Thank you, Jess. Is that, bourbon shows no signs of slowing down here in the US. I think we are seeing some like price sensitivity at last, but, as a category, it's still going crazy. People are continuing to buy it, really excited by it. But, my understanding, and you've sort of confirmed this, is that demand is still pretty subdued outside the US, and that I've had more than one producer, say, like, we are looking towards the international markets, as part of our growth plan for the long term. But no one's really given me any details about how they're approaching, selling outside the US. Probably because they haven't quite figured it out yet. Because, again, for most distillers and brands, they have enough demand here right now to sell everything they're making. And so it's, as we know in whiskey, the problem is always a few years down the road. It's a problem that's a few years in the future. And I'm sure they're thinking hard about it and developing strategies. But I think it will be something to keep an eye on. Maybe not this year, maybe not next year, but certainly in the next 3 to 7 years, whether or not the big bourbon producers, the ones who have put a lot of money into expansion and put a lot of money into laying down stock, whether they are able to develop demand in other markets, Western Europe and the UK being a big one, but also, I've heard China being mentioned. Yeah, that's a question mark for me. There's no guarantee of success, as we all know in the whiskey business.
Did any of the three of you see a resolution on the increasing punitive tax on American spirit into Europe?
I want to say I saw like a flashing thing saying it was cancelled, and then thought, I'll wait till there's like an actual press release of that. and then never saw one. I'm going to assume it was cancelled because surely by now people would be starting to get really quite shouty about the whole thing.
Yeah, I think there's a temporary suspension. I don't think it's permanent, as you know, these things tend not to be until the can has been kicked down the road several times. But yeah, yes, I think that's been resolved for now.
Okay, because we just had that December 31 of 2023 coming around for whether the punitive tariff was going to hit 50%. And so if a can has been kicked, it wouldn't surprise me to hear that. But it certainly features into how is Europe responding to bourbon? What does it look like if you're an American producer trying to reestablish what you had going on pre-pandemic in Europe? And then obviously to your point, Susannah, there are more markets than just Europe for bourbon. I understand that. So.
Certainly. But Europe being a very mature whiskey drinking market, you know, of course, very appealing.
But I have friends who work for big brands here who were looking at how you strategize and how you place bourbon. I think one of the brands that one of my friends was looking at particularly is a brand that here in the UK is traditionally seen in supermarkets on discount. And it was how you tie that in with bringing in other kind of sister brands attached to it that they want to charge a lot more money for that, and how you do that without causing like a seismic shock of people being like, but I can buy blah, blah bourbon in the supermarket for £23 on discount in a supermarket regularly. Why on earth would I go to your insert name of online retailer here and pay £50 a bottle when we've only ever known this brand produce £20 bottles? But this is a conversation that also we can add into our future year in preview list. Scotch is having exactly the same identity crisis here in the UK. So
I was going to say, I think the bourbon producers or retailers can certainly, you know, have some conversations with their Scotch counterparts about that.
I've just had a look here, and the punitive tariff has been kicked down the can until March 31st, 2025. So we can put this into the year in preview 2025 episode.
There you go. All right.
That's quite a long kick.
Whoever kicked that, they've got good on them for working their legs. They don't miss leg day. That's nice.
Yeah, if I was good at sports,
I like this idea that December 31 is right around the holidays, but March 31, we'll all be in the office. You know, we can actually have a conversation then.
It sounds much more urgent as well. You know, like it's kind of end of Q1. It's nearly new financial year in the UK. You know, like lots of dates, all of which are completely irrelevant, and they'll continue kicking this down the road for.
Well, not to put too fine a point on it, but by March 31st of next year, God willing, we will have, a president who has been fairly elected, and everyone has accepted that, and there's no one trying to sort of raise a ruckus about their candidate not getting elected freely and fairly. So, you know.
There's a problem for the four of us, the future versions of the four of us, to discuss this time next year. So let's table that.
Okay, I'll write that on the list.
Can I?
Let's enjoy some of 2024
Can I quickly change that subject?
Please.
Before we look to the future, I just wanted to touch again on the American single malt. The codification of American single malt as a category within the U.S. And you may or may not have insight to this, but I was trying to think of another scenario in our modern history where we've gone through this and what that timeline has looked like. Is this common for it to have its own kicking of the can down the road, because it seems that's what's happening here? And are there reasons that you may have heard of why people haven't finally put the stamp on this?
I have no insight into that. I presume it is just caught in the bureaucratic quagmire of a government agency. From everything I can divine from, how the process has gone so far, it's been pretty by the book, pretty smooth, and has actually gone rather quickly because, the American Single Malt Whiskey Commission has had a really strong presence. They made a big push. They've been very organized. And at this point, there's nothing more anybody can do. We really just have to wait for the TTB to kind of like get its shit together and put a stamp on it and say, okay, it's done. And I don't, I have no insight into what might be taking so long, or even whether this is a long time to take. I mean, people have said, oh, it's coming in the next 90 days. They've been telling me that for over a year, and that hasn't happened. And I don't know where they get their information, and it might just be wishful thinking. So hopefully we see that happen this year. I think the TTB, just like they move in mysterious ways, and they just do their things when they feel like doing their things, and there's not really a particular deadline for them to get it done. And so we just all sit here and twiddle our thumbs.
It's unfortunate that changing the topic away from the government brought us squarely back to the government. If any listeners want to follow up for the mailbag episode, which is the next episode, our new colleague, Steve Hawley, is president of the American Single Malt Whisky Commission. And so we can ask him where that original, perhaps this will be ready in 90 days, comment came from. But we're going to have to be prodded in an email. We can't simply ask that question of him.
He's going to be delighted when the entire, of all the questions, are just 50 listeners writing in being like, so when is this happening though? As if it's Steve who's holding this whole thing up. Like, he's just like, oh, I'll get to it when I get to it. New Year resolutions.
I think it will be ratified before there's a Worm Tub episode of One Nation Under Whiskey. And there you go. I'm on the record saying that in my year in preview.
Wow. As the man who's not on social media, you have no idea what a dumpster fire you just caused by that one sentence.
Absolutely fucked us this day, sir.
It's like the number one conspiracy hole in the Single Cask Nation chat group is about the Worm Tub. You've set them off, and you're laughing because you are not going to take any responsibility for what you've just said, and you will continue to not be in the chat group and giving really zero fucks about the whole situation. Thanks.
I will say, though, that smart listeners know to send email to info@singlecasknation.com because they get me over there, and I have fielded Worm Tub episode questions through that medium, but I do get to avoid the socials, so I'm okay with that front.
Oh, listeners. Well, you now know where to email Jason to get him about Worm Tubs.
All right.
So, here we are. It's 15th of January, 2024. We have... we've got an extra day this year. I was trying to do the math there. And I was going to say we've got 350 days left. We have 351 days left in our year. What is piquing Susannah Skiver Barton's interest for 2024?
One thing, and this may not be for 2024, but it's certainly, I think, for the near future, is this phenomenon of big companies and smaller companies building or opening distilleries in China. What really, I've been looking at, it's like Pernod, I think just released a whiskey. Diageo's building a distillery. But what really got my attention was when Angus Dundee was like, we're building a distillery in China. And I was like, Angus Dundee? You are? I love Angus Dundee. I'm a huge Glencadam fan in particular. I think it's a really interesting, fun little company. And I have no insight into this, this announcement that they're building a distillery in China. But I find it very interesting to consider what's on the minds of these companies. Are they building these distilleries just for the Chinese market? Do they think there is a demand, or there will be a demand in China for Chinese-made single malt and blended whiskeys? Do they think there will be an export demand as world whiskey becomes a larger category, although it's still, I think, extremely small in comparison to almost everything else? Are they anticipating that there might be possible embargoes that China sets, or tariffs? I don't know if you guys pay any attention to the wine world, but a few years ago, China just all of a sudden, or seemingly all of a sudden to me, as a non-wine observer, just very casual, they came down with massive tariffs on Australian wine imports. China was, I think, Australia's largest export market at the time. And of course, Australian wine is a huge industry. So it created more than a kerfuffle. It was, I think, quite a crisis for a lot of Australian winemakers. And they've spent a few years sort of figuring out what to do about that. And the tariffs might have changed or been lifted. I haven't paid that much, as you can see, that much attention. But still, I think that was probably noticed by spirits producers. Like, look, China they're huge. They are a huge market, even if a tiny portion of people are drinking wine and spirits. They can come down with a tariff, and that can make a huge difference to a company's plans, to their bottom line. So perhaps by building distilleries, producing whiskey in country, there's a way to get around that. I think a lot about, it's made me think about the model in India. India is a huge whiskey market, although much of the whiskey they consume is not whiskey by the rest of the world's standards, in that it's made with ingredients other than grain. Nevertheless, Diageo, Pernod, the big companies all have distilleries in country where they produce single malt. They may produce grain whiskey as well. Maybe not. They may still be using the sugarcane based stuff. But regardless, they'll also import blended Scotch whiskey and blend it locally with the locally made single malt or other spirits. That's a really, I think, good model for them. Has worked pretty well so far because India has really high tariffs on imported spirits. And so it's another part of the business that they've figured out how to make it work on this in-country production level. So bringing it back around to China, is this what they're thinking with China? Are we going to try an India model, or are we just going to try to avoid the impact of potential tariffs or embargoes, or, the geopolitical situation could change. And that could have massive ramifications as well. I mean, look at what happened with just Russia invading Ukraine. None of these companies have distilleries in Russia, but it's still been a big disruption to their business.
Yeah, sure.
Have you had a chance to try any Chinese whiskey?
I have not. I'm very interested to try it. As far as I know, there's only a couple of bottled products out there so far. Have you, Jess?
Yeah, I've had a bit of it, but I can't be mega helpful about it because I've only had it in the capacity of being a judge for the World Whisky Awards. So obviously everything comes blind. It's just a barcode. So there's nothing on it. We only try according to set categories. So we had it, I think maybe before Christmas I was in Norwich and we had maybe 4 or 5 of them. We had a long conversation amongst ourselves about it because they are, I would say, at least the ones I have tried, definitely not like Scotch. But then we had a conversation of like, well, maybe the producers aren't trying to make a Scotch whiskey. They're maybe focusing, like you're saying, perhaps on a domestic product where the palate is very different to a Western palate. And a lot of the flavours that we were getting in the whiskies we were trying are not things I would expect to be picking up out of anything out of Scotland. But maybe that's going to be the norm for Chinese whiskey, because why would they try and make it taste like Scotch whiskey if they don't have to? And maybe we were kind of speculating on the idea that what they're trying to produce is for a market who maybe also wouldn't necessarily have tried Scotch whiskey. They're going to be more like shochu and bayou drinkers. They're coming at it with a different palate and a different set of ways and traditions of drinking it. So when Chinese whiskey becomes more of a product, maybe it's not going to look how we were talking about it. It could also be, when I was talking to Christopher Coates, who heads up the awards, like a lot of the stuff that gets entered into the World Whisky Awards can also be, like small producers who are in countries like China, who are maybe not necessarily traditional whiskey producers, who are looking for critical feedback of their product so that they could try and then steer what they're doing towards a particular profile or style. So it was really interesting. I was very surprised when my categories came up on one of the days that there was a bunch of Chinese whiskey in it. I'm going to be perfectly honest, I didn't really enjoy what I tried, but maybe that's because these are very early stage whiskies and they're not trying to appeal to me as a drinker. They're not trying to target what I like and what I drink. But definitely interesting. And it hadn't occurred to me to look at it like that. I had looked at it because the big names like Pernod and Diageo are involved. They were looking to set up whiskey distilleries, as I know of a whiskey distillery here in Scotland. But maybe they're not. I mean, a distillery is really just a process plant. You can build that anywhere. So maybe it's about educating drinkers who are interested in what other countries are producing, that it's not necessarily going to be what you're used to. And I think in Scotland, we're really spoilt with that. As Scotch drinkers, we expect when people call it whiskey from another country, they expect it to taste like something we have here, when there's no real reason for it to taste like we have here. If you're a distillery in Timbuktu, those people there like different flavours. So why would they want it to taste the same as it does in Scotland? So it's interesting, yeah. But my exposure, pretty limited.
I like your point there, Jess. One of the things that I think has carried the coverage of these new distilleries is that stills are coming from Forsyths. Distillery managers from Scotland are heading up projects over there. And I think maybe for us in the West, the feel was, well, this seems like a very Scottish model that they're trying to establish over there. I really like your point about other palates and other markets. And on top of your point, Susannah, as well, you could hit a very small percentage of Chinese whiskey drinkers or burgeoning whiskey drinkers and have an incredibly successful product on your hands as well. The numbers that come out, and we've had that as well with India, just simply a small percentage of that population would give you an incredible success. So it will be interesting to follow it, watch it, see where we go, see what assumptions we overcome as we learn more about the products coming out.
Yeah, and I think it's not a surprise when you see, the big names attached to doing projects in countries like this. But like you, Susannah, I was mega surprised when I saw Angus Dundee were setting up. Like if you'd asked me to pick another largest company to be setting up in China, I think I could have given you 20 guesses before I got to Angus Dundee, because in my mind they're quite a traditional quite traditional and conservative in the way they conduct business, at least here in the UK. Like they produce cracking liquid, but they kind of do it pretty quietly. There's a whole bunch of other people that I would maybe have put a stab at being people that would set out in China before them, but they obviously see the potential in the market for what they want to do. So I'm really interested. I think them more than anybody else to see why they've decided in a time where it feels like everybody's opening in Campbelltown. They were like, hey, let's just ship off to China and we'll just set up in Campbelltown instead. China instead of Campbelltown, I should say. Too many C's.
Susannah, before we get too deep into 2024, actually, I want to give you a big thank you and pay due diligence here to what we established last year. We concluded our year 6 and we kicked off our year 7 with such a focus on the environment and such an attempt to move beyond greenwashing by brands, something we discussed at length this time last year. And it was fascinating to bring on people like David Thompson from Spirit of Yorkshire, to bring on the Whisky Supply Sisters out of Colorado, to actually talk about agriculture and actually get back to soil health and root structures. And we always referenced you and we always referenced that episode and we kept it fresh. But on top of the environmental aspect, we also talked about women in whiskey and talking about that in a meaningful way and trying to lift up women when presented with the opportunity, supporting women when presented with that opportunity. And so on one half, I want to talk environment with you. On the other half, I want to circle back to an article that you wrote for Insider, which is you are a woman in whiskey, a whiskey writer, a whiskey taster, and yet you had a pregnancy where you're obviously not imbibing alcohol. And can you talk a bit about what that was like and the challenges of that and what you learned coming out of that and what you'd like to do with that knowledge going forward?
Yeah, it was a weird 2023 because I did not drink for most of it. Even I had my baby at the end of September, and even then, like as anyone with a a newborn child can tell you, drinking alcohol is the last thing on your mind when you're sleep deprived. So I've had a few nice whiskeys since then, but my habits have changed. Maybe not permanently, but certainly for now. As a woman who always knew I wanted to have a child, I spent years thinking about how I could make it work with my job, how I could start trying to conceive a child without telling people, because I wanted to cut off alcohol, from like the minute I could possibly be pregnant, just to be extra safe. So working from home and working mostly for myself meant that was actually, I solved that problem because I could just, if I had a Zoom call where we were tasting a whiskey, I could just nose it and pretend to take a sip and then put it down, and no one would be any the wiser. And when it came to doing tastings for reviews, I just spat everything, which I was in the habit of doing for the most part anyway. I would maybe take one swallow for the full finish. But as you guys know, I think about 50% of my impression of a whiskey comes in on the nose, and then 40% on the palate, and then the finish is at most 10%. I mean, a bad finish can break a whiskey, and a great finish can bump it from being really good to excellent. But I didn't feel I was missing that for the most part, because if anything, my ability to nose was even better than before I got pregnant. So there were ways to get around the mechanics of the job and be able to do it and not feel that I was doing a subpar version of it. But the bigger issue for me was always, are people going to take me seriously as a person who's not drinking, but who is writing about whiskey and tasting whiskey and at times scoring and reviewing whiskey? And that's an anxiety that I had and still kind of have, because people are judgy, even if they're not consciously judgy. You see a woman with a big pregnant belly and she's got a bunch of bottles around her and some tasting glasses in front of her. And what do you think? That immediately probably some terrible thoughts, even if you don't mean to think them.
Yeah. Sure.
And being a writer, so much of my job depends on access to distillers, access to brands. I mean, I'm not ashamed to say I accept a lot of free samples. Otherwise, I'd never be able to afford to buy these whiskeys to write about them and review them. But I was worried that that access would diminish because people would say, well, she's had a baby, so she's not working, or she's not doing what she used to do. She's not taking, we can sort of bump her down a little bit in terms of priority because, I was worried about being written off, and I'm kind of still worried about that. It was interesting. I'm coming back from maternity leave. I took 3 months, which is pretty standard in America, maybe even on the better side. But I was still checking my email the whole time. I was still corresponding when I needed to with people. And it's so funny. Apparently some people just saw I was on maternity leave and stopped corresponding with me. They stopped, and it's just a matter of my email being included on a list to send out hey, here's some news. And I'm someone mentioned, they're we'll put you back on our active list. And I'm I should have been on your active list this whole time. Just because I'm not responding doesn't mean I'm not reading, or that I won't read it when I come back. But I want to know what's going on with the brands you represent. I need to know oh, this person took a new job, or, this distillery has a new feature or whatever. The world didn't stop spinning for me. So I can't fully articulate kind of what this means for me, or where I am with my anxieties, because they're still very active. But I mean, the way I do my job has changed probably permanently. I do have a human being that's dependent on me now. I'm not going to jet off at the drop of a hat. Not that I did that very often in the past, but there were a couple times where someone was like, you want to come do this thing and it's happening in 2 weeks? And I'm like, yes, not going to do that anymore. I'm going to need a little more notice. But I don't know. I think probably it's going to make me better at my job in the long run too. I think when you open up a new life experience, whether that's having a child or moving to a new place or, you know, any of these kind of major things that happen to people in their lives or that they choose to do, that opens up new elements of your thinking, new ways of looking at the world. And so if you're conscious of that and you try to use that, then, you know, you can put it to good use in whatever your goals are. So that's kind of my hope.
You alluded to it a second ago, but just to return to it, we talked in the last recording about you making the full-time move to North Carolina, and you just mentioned a moment ago about working from home and kind of controlling what's coming in and out of your home. Do you think if you'd still been in New York, you'd have been able to pull off this, I don't want to say secret in a bad way, but when you were trying to keep it in-house, could you have pulled off pregnancy in the same way, or the attempts?
I think it would have been harder.
Getting pregnant in the same
It would
way?
have been harder. A lot of what I did in New York was very public. I would go to events and, you know, hobnob with people. And if I had just stopped drinking all of a sudden, definitely would have been noticeable. And a lot of people are very polite and do not ask, which is good. You should never ask somebody why they are not drinking alcohol. It's none of your business.
Yep.
It could have nothing, you know, could be a medical reason or any other reason. Don't worry about it. Focus on yourself. But still, I'm sure some people would have asked me. And I don't know last year, it was about this time where I was, early stages of pregnancy. And I was like, I'm doing dry January. You know, like I visited a distillery and they're like, we're going to do a gin and cheese tasting for you. And I'm like, that's great. I'm going to need a spit cup. I'm doing dry January, you know? And then like after that, I was just like, oh, I'm not drinking today. You know, like you can make things up. Oh, I'm on antibiotics. But, look, any women out there listening who need to conceal their pregnancy in an alcohol setting, you just feel free to get in touch. I have lots of ideas. I have lots of tried and true tips. You know, if you just keep a glass in your hand, nobody is going to ask you why you're not drinking. The liquid in that glass never has to go down. You're just like, oh, I'm just holding a glass and like socializing with people. Great. You're drinking, even if you never once take a sip. Take it to the bathroom, pour a little out. Boom. I don't know if it would have been possible in the same way. You know, I would have had to change my habits and behaviors if I wanted to sort of keep it under wraps until I was ready to share it with people publicly. So,
what a thing
great
to have
question.
To consider.
Right? Men never have to think about this. I think about all the other whiskey writers that I know who I would sort of say, you know, like have a similar job to mine in the sense of, you know, work for themselves, maybe do this and that, you know, freelancing and like, you know, almost every single one of them is male. And a lot of them are dads, you know, and I've known them for years and they might, you know, they would go to fewer events than the single people, or they would leave early so they could go pick up their kids, stuff like that. I mean, there's considerations for dads too, but they're not quite as encompassing in those physical ways as they are for moms or for the people who carry the pregnancy.
Wow. There you go.
No regrets, by the way. Like, I'm very happy to have my baby and be working in whiskey and being able to have both of those things. I think I'm very lucky. I think there are a lot of people for whom it would be not as possible. But I talk to a lot of female distillers who have kids about it too. And they are, you know, they've been great examples. Marianne Eves, she has 2 daughters. She was, you know, actively working as a blender when she was pregnant. Elizabeth McCall at Woodford Reserve. You know, there are several other women who work in the spirits space, you know, who have done this. And so that gave me a lot of encouragement when making the decision to go forth and try to have a baby.
And congratulations from all of us. Before I return the floor to my honourable colleagues and Joshua, I was going to easy peasy.
Oh, wow.
I just wanted to circle back to the other part of my question there, which is, how do you think environment went in 2023 within whisky circles. Do you think there was a more concerted effort to discuss it in real terms? Do you think we started moving away from some of the politicalization of the topic?
It's a great question.
What do you think that
I
looked
don't know
like?
that it made much progress in the American space. I continue to see Scotch whiskey companies talking about what they're doing. But a thought occurred to me this year that was like, well, they do have a political mandate in Scotland, right? And Jess, please correct me if I'm wrong, to either reach carbon neutral or there are these carbon goals that have to be achieved by a certain year. I'm going to say it's 2030, but I'm not.
Yeah,
I'm definitely.
It's soonish, but not like next year. I think some of them I'm not overly confident we're going to reach. But yeah, there's a lot more drive towards it. There's a lot of drive within Europe as well to do with the same. And it's funny because we did a little thing where we left Europe, but we've decided that we quite like some of their ideas. And environmentalism seems like one of them. I'm not sure. I'm still quietly skeptical that there's a lot of people talking about these things because it sounds like them we're doing something, right? And but the distilleries that I know here who are, I think across the board in Scotland, we've always been very aware of it. Maybe distilleries are more aware of, weather fluctuations and how that impacts their processes. So what can they do if, like water is a big topic? So how do you make sure that you are sourcing your water responsibly, which also can be a shorthand for making sure you've always got water? Like if you've ever been on Islay when it's particularly sunny, you'll hear a lot of distillery managers talking about the water's getting low up in the hills and, maybe we'll have to shut down production a little bit. I remember one of the festivals that I was over for an Islay at Lagavulin, when Georgie was still the manager there, they were talking about how low the water in the burn was. And she said, it's getting critical. We're going to have to cut production because we literally don't have enough water if it doesn't rain. And I had laughed because I was like, well, that's an odd complaint to have on Islay. Wishing for rain is not a thing we often do on the west coast of Scotland. But she was saying, yeah, it can be. And I know a lot of the Speyside distilleries have the same too in the summer when the water is low. That's when a lot of them traditionally will shut for maintenance. And it allows the distillery to do other things. But if you've got an increased pressure on you to keep the outturn up, then not having water isn't a good thing. And I think also with a lot of distilleries that are in more remote locations, they're thinking about the impact on the environment. So I think Ardnamurchan are phenomenal champions for how they are very considerate in the environment and how it tempers what they do. And so I feel like distilleries are taking it very seriously. I think maybe consumers are a little bit kind of more skeptical, as if it is a form of greenwashing. But I think if to these businesses it's a very real thing, especially if there are hard deadlines where they're going to be expected to be complying with these regulations that are coming in. Sorry, the listeners can't hear that Jason is waiting to put a very good point, but in doing so his thumbs come up and he's got a load of thumbs up on the screen. It's great. Do you not see it?
I didn't even see that. I'm
sorry.
Sorry. Okay, I will sit quietly with my hands in my pockets.
So your point, Jason,
is I was just to both points being made here. That's why, just personally, in our interviews, I didn't really want to go down a packaging path. I wanted to get back to snow-packed on Speyside mountains, right? And the water that's running out on Islay and the seed that's going into the soil, right? I wanted very tangible, real aspects of this because I agree with you that I think the consumer is in a bit of an eye roll stage. And I feel like we had the same conversation this time last year. Although it's interesting, I just saw Diageo talking about replacement packs, almost the wine in a bag, wine in a box, kind of the bag that's in that. And I feel like when Diageo are talking about something remarkably unsexy, right? You just go to a store, you buy your replacement bag, you stick that in the bottle that's in your house. That's when I feel like we're starting to move beyond greenwashing and we're actually on real solutions that are hard to market. It's more of a, if you want to get it on board with a better planet, you'll go and buy the unsexy bag. And then they'll start putting remarkable designs on the bag and they'll take on a life of their own. But I wonder if, could that be an in for the American side of this, Susannah, or are you a little more worried about where the in might lie?
That could be. I think that, yes, the challenge is getting people to buy a replacement bag to go in a bottle. I mean, part of what an issue in America that the UK doesn't have is our just very different alcohol regulation, and the fact that we have got 51 different sets of laws here for each state and DC, and having like refillable packaging would be impossible here as the laws are currently written. Like it's literally banned.
Mm-hmm.
I had this conversation with someone at Nucknean, and I'm ashamed to say I've forgotten her name, but she's in charge of, some of their environmental.
Annabelle?
It wasn't no, it was not Annabelle. It was one of her staff, but. And this was a couple of years ago, so
okay, I'll stop throwing names.
It's fine, but I said, we were talking a lot about the environmental aspect because, of course, Nucknean, they're right up there, very near Ardnamurchan, very concerned with being carbon neutral. I think they might even be like they're beyond net zero. What do we call it when you're returning?
Like carbon negative.
Carbon negative. Thank you. And packaging is a big concern for them because bottles are heavy. Shipping bottles takes a lot of energy. And they hadn't quite figured out, they had some ideas that they thought they might trial with, a small set of consumers, but they hadn't quite figured it out either. And I think that is going to be a really tough nut to crack. But good on Diageo for working on cracking it. I imagine other companies are doing so, probably not with the same urgency. And again, I think in the US, it's just a much less, as Jess pointed out, it's just a much less visible issue. People, I don't want to say care less, but I think they might care less. I certainly think a lot of American whiskey drinkers are not buying or thinking about buying whiskey based on environmental considerations. But this kind of ties in a little bit with something I did want to bring up, that is relevant to everyone on this call, which is this trend that has been building for a few years, and I think is maybe moving and getting some more momentum of Scotch single malt distilleries, particularly bringing back old ways of doing things, such as floor maltings, such as longer fermentations, such as even direct fire stills in the case of Glengarry, and whether or not they're bringing back these old ways for flavor creation, which is paramount in great Scotch whiskey. But I wonder, and I don't know the answer to this question, I wonder if some of those ways are also more environmentally friendly. I tend to think maybe not, because scale, tends to, as you go up, the impact per unit goes down. But I could be wrong, at least in the case of, perhaps with floor maltings, if the grain is just coming from the field next door, like it is at Kilchoman, that does seem like it would be fairly low impact, minus the amount of energy, you're literally the peat or other, material that you're burning to dry that grain. But I don't know if you guys, have thoughts on this, whether environmentally minded or just about this trend in general, about this refocus on creating flavor in the old ways.
So I have a kind of point that's before you, there's 2 points. Stay with me on this journey. So talking of doing old and new, mixing them together, I have a real love for Harris Distillery and everything they're doing. My grandparents lived on Harris, and so I've been watching very carefully what this distillery have been doing for a long time. And when they started out doing the gin in anticipation of the whiskey coming out, One of the releases they always talk about, they're very heavily invested in community and the effects of hard living on the islands, especially remote islands like Harris and Lewis, and what that does to a community. One of the things that they have started doing, and they dropped them this Christmas and last Christmas, they've worked with a ceramicist who has created these really cute little like half bottles. They're all hand thrown. And that's to do with this old-fashioned idea of you took a drink to somebody's party to share with you. And I quite like that they're selling this for the gin they're doing aluminium recyclable packaging. The idea being that instead of, I'm sure everybody listening has seen a Harris gin bottle. If not, head to your Google machines. They're very beautiful, but they're quite heavy. And obviously there's an environmental impact there of the glass. And so one of the things that I think Harris have been quite canny in recognizing is that you're probably going to get through a bottle of gin faster than you probably would a bottle of whiskey. I'm just putting it out there. And so they sell this like aluminium, same material as your can of whatever, Dr. Pepper, Sprite, Coke. And they have a bottle, so they're encouraging you to keep hold of the beautiful glass bottle and then refill it with this aluminium, paired in with this idea of, they were calling them the Kaylee bottles, that you would take them to kind of this old new crossover, and it's like recycled marketing, which I think is quite fun. I'm not sure really I've heard Harris talking as heavily about environmental impacts as to what they're doing as, say, Nuckneen. And I do know Nuckneen looked at packaging. They talk a lot about the recycled glass in their bottles. And again, their bottles are really beautiful. What could you do with them instead of just throwing them away, I guess, at the end? But I do think your idea of like these old... like very, can we call it like kind of farmhouse distilling styles, this idea of like very rustic, very basic-y, you know, like full malting your own barley from that field there out of the window to running your stills direct fire. I wonder if like old is the new. I'm not sure how you can tie that in, because I would have thought that the kind of progression towards more modern distilling would allow for more efficiencies, where maybe more efficient equals less energy used. And if you are slow running stills, longer fermentation, you're not using more energy. But I know that lots of these distilleries are also looking to offset that with some sort of like green energy on site, whether that's maybe you've got a turbine or some sort of like roof paneling, like solar panels, or using water for your source of energy, like hydroelectricity. Maybe that comes into it too. It definitely is something you hear a lot of distillers talking about this. I don't know. I think maybe we're selling this concept a little bit too hard of like the old styles equals better. And I think that's a very dangerous path to get down. Like, oh, we're doing it like they used to do in the 1800s when we were distilling in the hills. And, you know, we were hiding from the excise men. Well, yeah, we were also making a load of really shonky alcohol that made people go blind. I'm not sure we need to go, like, back.
But are we really? You know, I think there's a handful of small distilleries that have production that is sub 1 million liters per year, that are really such a small part and parcel of the overall industry. To have them shout about it is a really good thing from a visibility standpoint, and you hope that it sends messages to the consumers. You hope that it sends messages to other distilleries. But I think for this to really matter, it's got to be the Glenfiddichs and the Glenlivets, and then on top of that, your Invergordons of the world, your Starlaws of the world, that are these massive facilities producing millions and millions and millions of liters to really make the sort of impact that these smaller companies, smaller, louder companies are touting. You know, they're doing their own part, and that's awesome, but it really has to bleed over into the producer that's making whiskey for the masses and not for the folks like us.
Well, and that brings us back to these, these goals, these environmental goals, right? That have deadlines for UK distilleries. And Jess said she's perhaps dubious that they'll all be met, but they're certainly supposed to be met. And the companies that are touting, oh, we've put in our solar array, or oh, we're doing this, or whatever. I mean, Are they doing it because it's the right thing to do? Or are they doing it because they'll be fined if they don't? Does it matter? Maybe it doesn't. Maybe it doesn't.
Yeah.
And maybe this farmhouse style distilling is a red herring in all of this. But I do think it's important for consumers in terms of discussing, what makes the whiskey that we enjoy. What makes that, right? And is it? And the scale shouldn't matter, but if we're talking about fermentation, that is a crucial part of, making up the flavor of the whiskey we enjoy. Floor maltings may or may not be. I'm not totally, I'm not sold that like floor malted barley tastes better than barley that's been malted in an industrial setting. It's less consistent, so it's creating more interesting flavor, perhaps. I don't know. And there's not, and direct fire stills, same thing. It's not a consistent heat source. And so you're making spirit that takes more, work on the part of the distiller and then later the blender to turn it into the bottled product that everyone's going to know and love. But I've totally lost where I was going with this, except to say, I think seeing this conversation happen in Scotch whiskey is exciting. And I think perhaps we can give a little credit to the American craft whiskey movement, because they started that conversation in this country. Yeah. That has now for sure spread to the bigger bourbon producers, and American whiskey drinkers now are asking questions about grain source, about, of course, time and barrel. Everyone's been asking that forever, but they're asking questions about these sources of flavor that 10 years ago, I don't think was crossing anyone's mind. And maybe that's not the case in Scotch. It certainly could be developing independently. But I think it's ultimately a good thing for drinkers and for the industry to have consumers engaged with that element of the whiskey, to where, a generation or two ago, they were concerned about what a particular bottle, picking that off the shelf, how that made them look as a consumer, rather than whether or not, the taste was something that really appealed to them or was special or different. And now with this proliferation of brands across all categories, consumers are like, oh no, I should actually be drinking what I like and finding out why I like it. We're very curious, questioning the source of that flavor and that whiskey. And maybe eventually that does extend to the environmental aspect of it. It's like, okay, now I've figured out where the flavor comes from, but how is it getting, like, what goes into making it? Is that responsible? Is it ethical? Should I be, thinking about that as well? The same way I think about my farmhouse eggs and my pasture raised beef.
Exactly.
I know we talked about this last year. I do feel like I'm repeating myself, but
I'm nodding my head vigorously, because I agree with you where I think part of this needs to come from the consumer, but I also think there's a large part for the consumer, which is make something that I like, and I'm going to trust you to make sure you're doing it in the right way, right? Like, I'm not going to be standing over you asking about, kilojoules, right? like, do any of us know enough about energy to actually be asking smart questions about producers, and are you saving energy in that way? We're just going to trust that you are, and maybe if you are, you can crow about that, and it'll help me buy and feel good about what I'm buying from you. So yeah, I'm just nodding my head vigorously.
Speaking of kilojoules, no, I'm joking.
Speaking of kilojoules, I mean, we say that every episode.
I had another question of an aspect of whiskey production that is tied very closely to the environment, and then I had a question about consumer purchasing habits, but we'll go to that second. So one of the things that I found, the more Scotch whiskey producers that I talk to, their access to ex-bourbon barrels has gotten difficult. Buffalo Trace has cut off supply to distilleries like Kilchoman and some other distilleries where they would sell directly, in part because, maybe they own other distilleries that they can lend that cask to, right? A little vertical integration.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they have an Irish distillery now.
Right? And so, and you can say that about a number of other major distilleries that have a parent company, right, that own a multitude of distilleries, and they're keeping things in-house, while at the same time, and we touched on it earlier in this conversation, the craze for bourbon doesn't seem to have died. It continues to tick along, which means we continue to cut down trees to make new bourbon barrels. And I remember hearing some time ago, and it could just be people throwing out what ifs, but there was conversations of, boy, this is a lot of wood that's being cut down. If we remember just a couple of years ago, we ran into issues where small craft producers had to wait for their wood for a multitude of reasons. At what point do we try to think about the environment a bit more and maybe cut down less wood and adjust our laws as to what can and cannot be called bourbon, or how do we adjust legal definitions so that we're maybe being more conscious of the wood that we've already harvested and can reuse it properly in the way that malt whiskey producers can use it much more effectively.
that will never happen for bourbon. I will tell you what will happen first. What will happen first is
hell will freeze
the
over.
world will burn.
The lumber industry, which currently encompasses, oak for bourbon barrels, oak for furniture, oak for home building, whatever, construction. I think the industry you'll see some specialized companies pop up that are just going to be doing oak for bourbon barrels. I don't know enough about this industry, by the way, to give more detail than that, but I think that's what would happen first, right? They would be able to, they know who to work with, the mills and the loggers and everything to cut down, smaller patches of trees. Like someone owns some land and they're like, I got a bunch of oak trees, can I make some money off of them? And they're like, yes, you can. We're going to give you this much, per square foot of usable lumber, and boom, we'll get it done. The industry right now, as I understand it, is pretty macro, and so I think we'll see it become we'll see more micro suppliers, let's say, pop up to serve those needs. Of course, it's going to make barrels more expensive. They've already been getting more expensive. Welcome to the world of exploiting natural resources and not necessarily replenishing them adequately. Of course, credit to many of the big bourbon companies. They are actively engaged with forestry initiatives, with studying white oak, with replanting. They understand that that's important to their future health, but trees take decades to grow. So it's not as if it's going to create a solution in our lifetimes. What I think you will also see is sourcing white oak from other parts of the world. American white oak is very good for making barrels. It's used not just in this country, but in winemaking and other spirits all over the world. But I don't think it's necessarily not the be all end all. There are trees everywhere. So are we going to see logging in Eastern Europe or in parts of Asia? I'm sure we will. I'm sure that will happen. And that might change the way the bourbon tastes, depending on, the conditions those trees are grown in and whether they're processed, where they are logged and seasoning and everything else. But you will see that happen. You'll see the oak coming from somewhere else before you will ever see the law change in this country that bourbon must be aged in a new charred oak barrel.
Interesting.
Well,
Oh, I like it. That is written down in the notes. Return to
I
this
always
point.
felt like
Awesome.
it was
I
probably
like
more of a
that.
political decision rather than an environmental one that drove the bourbon laws. I have to say, this side of the pond, every so often you'll be at a distillery and they'll, when we get to... listeners have heard me before talking about my distillery bingo card that I play when I'm touring distilleries. We get to the bit where we talk about casks, and I'm like, okay, there's like 3 possible points we can tick off here. One is always how very, very expensive sherry casks is. And inevitably, I would say maybe half of the time, whoever's doing the tour will, of course, make a throwaway comment being, bourbon barrels are so cheap because the Americans only use them once, and that's great for us because we get them for super cheap. And then they will kind of like pull the rug from under you and they'll say, but they are talking about reusing those barrels, so might not always be this way. And I just don't think the logging industry in the US is going to allow that to happen anytime soon. I think it's a rumor that goes around every so often. There's one of these, that's it, the bourbon industry are going to start reusing their casks. But I think these are one of these little kind of tremors that come without the real kind of context, which is there's this absolute mega giant running the background. There's a talk about it, sure. But like you say, that would mean that the timber industry, in theory, would lose a load of business, which, given how big it is in the US, I just don't see that happening. I don't see it being like, so this week, lads, we've decided we're going to reuse all the casks starting next month. And sorry, Scotland, it's been a great ride, but thanks for coming along. I think what will happen is supply chains get cut, like we're seeing with Kilchoman losing their Buffalo Trace contract and having to switch to using another distillery. And I've heard the Kilchoman guys saying we're not really going to know what effect that has on Kilchoman for like a good 3, 4, 5, 10 years when they've built it into and they've run out of the Buffalo Trace in their mix. I think that's a much bigger possibility, is that these distilleries are not going to get access to these casks instead of it being like environmental.
And I don't know if we talked about this last year or not, but cask rinsing has already started impacting Scotch whiskey maturation. Did we talk about this? Where
it doesn't ring a bell.
Bourbon distillers. This is a thing that's happened before, but it apparently is happening with at greater scale now. Yeah. They are emptying their casks, and instead of shipping them right off to whoever has purchased them, they are putting in another gallon or 2 of water, either leaving them in a hot warehouse for a few weeks, or maybe deliberately heating them up, and then taking out that water, which has now pulled out a lot more, as the wood has expanded under heat, it's released the bourbon that was trapped in it, and they're using that to proof down, whiskeys. And that changes the character of the cask that is then filled with new spirit in Scotland. And it changes the way that spirit matures. And that, I think, is certainly already having an impact. I did write an article about it. I don't want to talk about my own writing, but I did write an article about it in 2020. It might have been early 2023 or late 2022, but it was John Glazer was a primary source on it, because he was the one who clued me into this, because he created a compass box expression called Orchard House based on the fact that he had all this spirit that had matured in these rinsed bourbon casks, and it tasted very different from what he had initially expected. So he was like, okay, I've got all the spirit. What do I do with it? Okay, new blend. And it's a delicious blend. That's one sort of additional layer on this as well, is that the quality of the casks that Scotch whiskey distilleries are receiving now could be, and in some cases certainly is, very different from what they were getting even a few years ago.
Yeah, I seem to recall having a conversation with our friend David Stirk years back when he had the Creative Whiskey Company, and there were some casks he was pointing out that the distillery had their liquid in Jim Beam casks, and he said, I'm going to be sitting on these casks for a while, because these Jim Beam casks are doing nothing. Since they've been doing the devil's cut process to the barrels, it's the spirit isn't interacting with the wood in the way that it was. So I'm just going to be sitting on this. And I think that's a similar, if not the same process a similar
It's the
process.
same, yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
there you go.
That's really interesting. Do you think that's because there's an increase now? Certainly distilleries talk a lot more about casks coming in whole, or sometimes we hear people talking about shipping them wet. Whereas traditionally, I guess the casks were broken down into just big bundles of staves and then reassembled this side of the pond once they got here. Do you think that's also... Because I've often wondered about that when I've been to like Speyside cooperage and you watch them, it's really impressive. You watch them build them up from like, you know, these bits of cask and they re-put them back together. I mean, there's absolutely zero guarantee there that the cask that comes out of Speyside cooperage is made from the staves that were once a cask in the US. It could be the constituent parts of, well, essentially every stave from a different cask.
Yeah, Franken casks.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of interesting. So, and there's definitely a conversation happening here, this in Scotland, about, you know, if you're sourcing casks whole, that's a premium thing. That's a luxury because you're shipping huge volumes of air instead of filling a container with staves and then having a really cool bunch of highly skilled coopers knock up the casks this side of the pond. So, you know, if you're a distillery who's bringing in whole casks from, you know, these producers in the US that you can even name, you know, because, oh, this is a Jim Beam cask, this is a Willett cask, this is a whatever, that's traditionally seen as like a step up in your bourbon sourcing. I must admit, like, I've not really thought about the idea of, like, you're calling it the devil's cut. That's kind of the reverse of what we talk about in Jerez, as casks are not really traditional sherry casks anymore. They are kind of that in reverse. We're putting liquid in for them to flavour the casks and then we're bringing them in. It seems pretty mad that in America you're doing the... Well, I guess why not? Why not get as much out of your one cask as you can? Is that maybe slightly more environmental? Because if you can only use a cask once, you're absolutely maximising every last drip you can get out of that cask. You guys are being environmentally friendly. You've just not considered it like that.
Look at us. USA.
Look at you go.
USA.
Well, I think too, we are, I believe, and again, please go read my article because that's the truth. And whatever I say here, if I'm wrong, whatever the article says is right. I've just forgotten. But I believe John Glaser is in fact seasoning casks, right? To recreate or to get to the kind of flavor, seasoning bourbon casks, I should say, and I'm air quoting bourbon here, to get to the kind of flavor he wants to achieve in his mature spirit. And I do think we will see that happening in Scotch whiskey. Maybe not at scale yet, but it's happened with sherry. I don't see why it couldn't happen with bourbon if those casks are not giving up the correct flavors that distillers want for their products. You know, they might just have to start bringing in or creating their own bourbon-like spirit and letting it sit there and season the cask for a year or two.
But imagine if we end up seeing the same process for two opposite reasons. Sherry because there is no industry, and bourbon because there's too high demand on it.
Yeah.
But we end up seasoning on both accounts.
That, or we just migrate the flavors of these, you know, mainstream whiskeys, or all Scotch whiskeys, right, that rely on this. If it becomes a very widespread problem, just migrate those flavors slowly, and the palate accepts it. And in 20 years' time, you know, Glenlivet tastes a little different, maybe a lot different. I mean, that's thus it ever was with whiskey. You know, as much as they like to, and I hope this is on your bingo card, Jess. You know, it's like, oh, we've been using the same water and recipe for 150 years, and you know, this is Johnny Walker's never change, or you know, whatever. It's like, no,
that's definite.
You can taste an example from within our own lifetimes. You know, and it's a very different whiskey. So
that's great. That's a great way to feed the conspiracists, though. You know, I've never. Have you ever met somebody who's poured you whiskey that's in like an old example and a new example, and been like, the newer one, absolute belter, brilliant. Old one, load of shite. I'm so glad we don't have this anymore, because there are so few examples I could give you where you pour an older one and everyone's like, oh no. Oh, you know, like literally I've done tastings where we did like a kind of old versus new, and I'm telling you, new did not come out good. We did like old Johnny Walkers from the 1940s. Johnny Walker Red from the 40s and 50s is absolutely delicious. and we put it next to a
Yeah.
Bond Johnny Walker
Yeah.
Red, and we were like, sorry guys, just gonna pour this. You don't have to drink it, just have a little sniff. I'm so sorry. You know, I guess without context, if you have no context for the new and improved distillery, Glen, blah blah, that's brilliant. But there's always going to be some asshole whiskey drinker who is going to bring you out the 80s, the 60s version of that, and then you're like, oh, what did we lose? Yeah, and
Well, here, I will give you the example. Old Four Roses is garbage because it was a blended whiskey. Modern Four Roses is amazing because Jim Rutledge revived it and made it a straight bourbon again in the early 2000s, and it's fucking phenomenal.
Magic. Yep.
okay, good.
Without a
We need
doubt.
more of these
Without a
examples
doubt.
because there's not many of them in the Scotch world.
I think another fair one is just the transition from sherry being exported into the UK in cask to the Spanish government saying no, sherry needs to be bottled in Spain sometime in the 70s, right? And so now the access to ubiquitous sherry casks went down sometime in the 70s, and then in the 80s people stopped drinking sherry, so there was just fewer casks. And so you got to see sherry casks slowly being transitioned out, more bourbon casks slowly being transitioned in. So back to your point, Susannah, of this, let's stretch it out a little bit. Whiskey is a product that takes time to mature, so you can make those transitions in a slower, more purposeful manner.
Yeah.
Yeah, 2011, 2012, I put old Bunnahabhain 12 up against new Bunnahabhain 12, the old Lechig up against the new Lechig. New stuff far outstripped.
There you go. That's true.
In those particular examples, which is why I'm not saying spirit writ large, since I have early 21st century Lechigs sitting 3 feet away from me. So, and I know Bunnahabhain is a fan of somebody else in this conversation.
There's I would also say there's a noticeable improvement on Bowmore. I can tell you the years, like everything post 96. There's a radical difference in that decade of Bowmore going into the 90s and Bowmore coming out of the 90s. And I think that Bowmore is doing some really cool stuff. So yeah, I think it's also about catering for people's tastes, isn't it? And it's very easy once you've got a long way down the rabbit hole to long for the glory days of the old sherry. But if we're trying to get, access for people coming into drinking whiskey, then I think it's radically unfair to be beating people who are coming in with a stick that's like, this all used to be so much better. Like, well, great.
Absolutely.
100%.
I'm permanently devastated that I was not born in an era where 1960s Ardbegs were available on a shelf for $3 and $6. And, because realistically, even if I had been in that era, I wouldn't have the appreciation for it, and it would be expensive compared to going out and buying a bottle of Grant's or something else. It was always a luxury product. It's just that when you look at it with 2024, got that right, 2024 eyes, it changes.
Nice pause.
It changes your aspect. But yeah, as somebody coming into whiskey, I'm always really. I try really hard to make sure that it's not if you'd been here 10 years ago, wait, I could have shown you some stuff. Because that's not going to encourage people to drink whiskey. And really, at the end of the day, that's the purpose of why the four of us are sat here, is because we want to share drams and share experiences. So, yeah, and as always with whiskey, it's kind of half in, half out. You can argue both ways. I think, the old stuff was pretty cool. And I like, to go back to your earlier point, the idea of maybe we are looking, now that we understand, oh, well, if we have a longer fermentation, this is the effect it has on the spirit coming off the still well. We seem to quite like that flavour, let's build that in. Now that we have a bit of a deeper understanding, rather than it being, we did a longer fermentation because it was over the weekend and nobody worked on a Sunday, so it didn't get sorted till a Monday. Mm-hmm. That maybe we can use our slightly more educated palates to build in flavours. I think that's something that's much more likely to come in whiskey, that because we understand how to create these flavors rather than them kind of being an accident. That they having a much deeper understanding in how to get a waxy texture in a whiskey, or a, I don't know, funkier, fruitier new make. That maybe that's what we'll see more of in our coming lots of distilleries as they're penciling what to do this year.
I wanted to change topics slightly, and I realize you've got a limited amount of time, Susannah, so maybe it'll be this question and maybe another one. We'll see how it goes. You have your clock, and we want to make sure you get out of get out of the house when you need to. I was thinking about consumer purchasing habits. And, going through the pandemic that we went through, consumer purchasing habits changed dramatically. People were buying all of the things because that's all they could do. But I'm not sure they drank all the things that they purchased, because come 2023, globally, it seems the overall sale of whiskeys, be it American whiskey or malt whiskeys, has changed. People are buying one bottle rather than two bottles, or what have you. They're going on vacation maybe rather than now that COVID's over and things like that. And I'm curious what you may be seeing on that front. Have you seen that slow down, and is there anything that you can specifically attribute it to, or even by word of mouth and people talking what they're seeing? And do you see a way out of it where maybe purchasings get?
Yeah, I think you're thinking like a person who saw good sales during COVID and is now seeing them slow down. I don't think there's any getting out of it. I think that was a blip. It wouldn't have happened without the fact that we had a pandemic where people were stuck at home and had no way to spend their money except to buy things, including whiskey. And so they did. And then once they had other outlets for their money, it started to slow. And that's just like, I don't think if you want to get back to that, then we're looking at another pandemic, and nobody wants that. It's a stabilization. I don't see, what I do see is some price softening, like people are becoming more price sensitive now, partly perhaps because they have other things to spend their money on, and partly because we've had some inflation. And in the case of bourbon, I think partly, maybe largely, because there's a lot of like overpriced bottles that are priced higher than what they're worth. And so the market is sorting that out by people not buying them. So yeah, I think it's just things are shifting back to the trajectory they were on pre-pandemic, or maybe slightly improved, right? Because when people bought extra whiskey or better whiskey than they were used to, they were exposed to new brands or bottles that they said, oh, I really like this, okay, I'm going to buy it again in the future. And they're just buying one instead of two because they don't feel. Remember, we were all stockpiling toilet paper. we were, that mindset carried over into the whiskey. I got a stockpile of whiskey, and now that sense of crisis has passed, and people are like, I don't need to. You know what? Like I'm going to buy a bottle, but I'm going to use the money from that would have gone to the other bottle, to go out for pizza this week instead. Yeah. Enjoy my life.
Well, I think some of the talk around how many releases are coming out, and that sense of FOMO that we had through the 2010s, building up to the pandemic, even though we didn't know that, got us, I think, to a point where you had to have all the new releases. And now if you miss the new release, there'll be another one. They have become a lot like buses in Glasgow city centre. There's another one coming in 5 minutes. Don't sweat this one.
It's a very good point,
I think that's
Jason.
feeding into part of this as well.
Yeah.
Say that again.
I think that's an excellent point, is that,
Cheers.
Yeah, there's still FOMO. There's lots of people still feeling FOMO about various specific bourbons and stuff. But the fact that there's a new special edition release basically daily now, means that there's always going to be something on the shelf a person can pick up, take home, and say, look at this limited thing that I got my hands on. Yeah. Even if it's not quite what maybe their friends are impressed by. I don't know. But there's still always going to be something. Yeah. It's a little exhausting.
And a bit of a dangerous road to be going down for a distillery who's really, they're making their money off of their core product. Well,
is it dangerous or is it smart? Because you can use all these limited editions to trial consumer response and then decide, oh, look, people really like this new whatever we put out. Let's bring it back in a couple years when we have enough stock and make it a core product, or a what I like to call a heavy limited edition. where it's like it's limited, but there's a lot of it. So you could probably find it. Also a lot and a lot of the new, the ever, each new thing that's coming out each day, a lot of it is not from big distilleries. I think they're very measured about, most of them are very measured about releasing new products, even limited editions. You're just seeing a lot of new brands, started up by someone who got a hold of a few hundred casks and said, great, I want to make money. Here's how I'm going to turn it around, and I'm going to sell this 4-year-old bourbon with no provenance, for $100 with a snappy label and, whatever other marketing things. And it's almost always just marketing things that they slap onto the bottle and the brand to make it appeal to people.
Mm-hmm. I think that's quite interesting. Mm-hmm. There was a bit of a hullabaloo here last week. There's a new distillery that have just put out their first release. And their first release is £200 a bottle. And I'm going to say that people were losing their shit, but not in a good way. I think it was quite interesting to watch the kind of reaction to I know like social media is a very dangerous place, but it's quite interesting to just kind of feel for people who are not kind of in my little bubble of whiskey, like people who are one step outside, who are still definitely interested in whiskey and are chasing new releases. And, especially because of where I am and the proximity to me, people who want to support a local distillery, it's very cool to be in at the beginning. It's just very interesting. I'd love to know their maths as to how they reached that number, because we all know that it doesn't cost £200 a bottle to produce a 3-year-old whiskey. It wasn't in a particularly fancy bottle, so I don't think it's like custom blown glass that's going to be 15 quid a go. I just think it's interesting. It did all sell out, which I think speaks to it was maybe speculators.
Oh boy.
But is that people who are hedging their bets maybe speculating on it? I also had seen that they had done a marketing sheet where they had select casks with specific cask numbers available for sale, and they wanted £1 million for cask number 1.
I'm sorry.
Oh,
wow!
And that's not an exaggeration.
That's not. I'll send you the photograph. £1 million, pounds, not dollars.
Wow.
Does all this sound like a jumping the shark situation?
100% jumping the shark. And I'm curious that in late 2023, 2024, we have this, like that kind of behaviour. I would thought would be much more kind of like. You would pitch that at the height of the pandemic. I mean, obviously it's 3-year-old liquid, so they had no choice, right? They couldn't have done that 2 years ago when the pandemic and everyone was sat at home just being like, yeah, buy this now. I find it interesting that there was an outcry of like, that's outrageously expensive, which I personally think it is quite expensive. And yet there's enough of the silent majority who are like, well, yeah, okay, fine, we'll just bet. 200 quid seems reasonable. It seems crazy, and that ties in when we're talking about price sensitivity. I think there is, but it's at different price points in a bottle. There's always the people in Scotland that for as long as I've been working in whiskey, which is quite a long time, people won't spend more than, whatever their fixed price is, but that fixed price doesn't really shift. So I'm talking about when I was working in retail, that price was about 50 quid. And that is 13 years ago. And what your 50 quid got you 13 years ago compared to what 50 quid gets you today is a very different product. And it's an interesting metric that doesn't seem to shift. Now, 50 quid is what I pay for my bottle, but 50 quid filling your car 13 years ago would have done you a lot better than 50 quid today. But we've just accepted that, fuel costs more. So when you go to the pump, that price is going to be higher than it was back ago. It's always struck me as weird that number for whiskey doesn't shift as easily. And so maybe what you're saying, Susannah, like stateside, when people are getting a bit kind of, I'm probably only going to take that one bottle this week, and if it's there next week when I go back to the liquor store, then maybe if I still want it, I will pick it up instead of it being no, I must take 2 now because I'm here. I think it hasn't quite hit the UK in the same way. Definitely, I think if you ask retailers, you'll see that things are not shifting as quickly, but I think the response to that is that retailers are being much more selective about what they put on the shelves. And instead of maybe taking all of an outturn or something, now you have to work across 2 or 3 different retailers if there's a set of something you want. For example, just to throw it out there, like the Diageo special releases. Some of the retailers local to me only took select bottlings. So if I was a collector who had to have them all, then I would have to, like fill in the gaps somewhere else. So maybe that's the kind of measured response back. It's not just about pricing, but making it so that if you're really desperate to have everything, you have to work harder as a consumer to go and get that.
Two very, very quick comments just from what you're saying there, Jess. Number one for me is, if you're a new distiller and you're putting out your brand new product and you sell it for 50, 60 pounds and you see it sell on secondary for 150, 200, you may very well say to yourself, maybe that money could have gone into our pocket and not into the secondary pocket. And yet, for us to see a distiller bring out £200 for a bottle is crazy. The fact that it all sold out doesn't undermine anything they thought, and that's hugely frustrating as well. And then to the second point of cask number one selling for $1 million, what's one of the things all three of us have talked about is more producers want the money that's 10 years in the future. They want it today. So if they sell you new make spirit, it's based on the price that cask would be in 10 years, not what new make spirit costs today. And the thought that cask number one from that distillery will one day, 30, 40 years in the future, be worth 1 million is the reason you say, I'll sell it to you for $1 million today. You make tomorrow's money today, or you at least ask for tomorrow's money today. And we've seen that across many corners of this industry. So those are my 2 points. I will say no more.
There you go. You've wrapped it up. Susannah, is there one thing that you're keeping your eye on? And I'm just, I'm slowly getting us out of here. Is there one thing that you're keeping your eye on for 2024 and beyond that we may not have brought up that you think we should have our finger on the pulse?
Yeah, celebrity whiskey. I know we're all probably tired of hearing about it, thinking about it, but it is very much still a thing. I'm so interested to see if it's going to be as much of a thing as, for example, celebrity tequila, which I think is, for some reason, I certainly think gets more buzz when, is it Kylie Jenner has 818? Kendall, I don't know which one. Anyway, one of the Ks.
Jason knows. He's really into them. Which one is it, Jason?
So perfect.
And The Rock with Terramana, and you've got many other examples and I'll just focus on bourbon in particular because there's a few celebrity scotches, but not that many. There's lots of celebrity bourbons, but I have not yet seen the Casamigos of bourbon. I haven't seen who's the George Clooney who's attaching himself to a bourbon. And I don't know if that's because there's just no one with that star power yet who has decided to get into the bourbon game, or if it's because the bourbon industry works differently than the tequila industry. And as far as, supply goes, it's just a different kind of game. But that's what I will be keeping my eye on, is kind of where are we going with all these celebrity brands? Which ones are going to pan out? Which ones are people actually buying and buying again versus like buying once for a lark and then never going back to? So I don't have any answers. It's just a really interesting open question for me.
Yeah, the Matthew McConaughey one has my attention because that seemed like that compromise between I am just a brand of bourbon and I am more of I'm even beyond a celebrity endorsement of bourbon. I'm actually in the room. I'm actually having the conversations with Wild Turkey about bourbon. That always struck me as slightly different.
Fair enough. Yeah, I think McConaughey's involvement with Wild Turkey has wrapped up. He certainly, I don't think, ever had an ownership stake. I don't think Campari would go for that. So it was more of a, we're going to pay you to help us with this and lend your celebrity cachet. Whereas with like Casamigos being the example I always go back to for tequila, Clooney for sure had an ownership stake and he cashed out big time when Diageo bought it. And there are some celebrity bourbon brands where the celebrities are owners and not just hey, we're here shilling. So, you know, the two Vampire Diaries guys, they've got Brothers Bond. It's an MGP sourced brand. It's bourbon and encompasses rye now as well. It's fine. It's MGP juice. You know, it tastes, it's well made. I think it's doing pretty well. It's an interesting one. Those guys are not as famous as George Clooney, but you know, they're very invested. They're out there actively selling and talking about and doing, you know, podcasts or whatever with people. So, you know, they're engaged in a way that, you know, whoever, I can't think of anyone else. I'm not going to name any names, but you know, other celebrities who are just like, sure, I'll drink your bourbon while I'm, you know, on Jimmy Fallon or something.
Yeah.
So, but I don't know.
Yeah.
Do you think it's helpful?
To have a celebrity endorsement?
Not specific to that brand, because I think it is helpful to that brand if it's a celebrity that doesn't necessarily own it, but they, you know, Matthew McConaughey joins Wild Turkey for a little bit to you know, get the brand out there. But I'm talking bourbon, rye, whiskey in general. Is it good for that category to have that Hollywoodification of your spirit?
It depends on what you know, how you're defining good, but I mean, is it going to help sell more of it? Yes, that's good for the people who make and sell the whiskey. Is it going to create lifelong consumers, you know, and translate into sustained sales? That's a less clear, you know, I don't know. I don't think it's a bad thing for the industry, though. It's bringing more visibility to whiskey. Okay. It's making whiskey more ordinary and mainstream and everyday for people. And I think that is good for those of us who love whiskey and work in whiskey and want to see whiskey be appreciated and enjoyed.
Well, Susannah Skiver Barton, it's been a pleasure bringing you back and talking with you again and picking at your brain and just hearing what you're thinking about and helping us, you know, shape some of our thoughts about, you know, some similar things that we're thinking about. So we raise our glasses to you, though mine's empty. Boo.
Oh.
Jason's
not
got water. That's true. And we hope you'll come back again come January 2025. And you know, just like you had said, you didn't listen back to the previous year's episode. I didn't do my homework. I listened to it last year, but I didn't listen to it in advance of this conversation because I don't like doing homework. But maybe next time around we can, at least I'll try to do my homework.
I'll at least, when I listen to this year's episode, make a little outline of what we talked about so that I can at least jog my memory.
Well, thanks again.
Well, cheers.
Yeah, cheers to you.
It has been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. I love talking to you guys. I'm so glad Jess is now a part of this on the regular, because it's nice to have a third voice, especially especially a voice who's based in a different market and has a different perspective. But yeah, this has been fun as always, and I really appreciate you guys asking me to be part of it.
Good to see you. Good luck for 24.
Woohoo!
Cheers.
Oh, wait.
The worst clank ever. Jason, that clank doesn't even work. It's like plastic on a... There you go.
You say that every time. No matter what I put together, you say, that is the worst one ever.
Yeah.